Who are you?
I'm Grace Francisco, and I'm a technical evangelist for Team System. And today we're talking with Doug Neumann, aka Dougie Fresh.
Ooh.
So, Dougie, where are you based, first of all?
Actually, I work on a product team, Team Foundation product team, that is half based in North Carolina and half based here in Redmond, or in the Seattle area. And I'm based out of the North Carolina office. So we work in between Raleigh and Durham, North Carolina, in the Research Triangle Park area.
Which kind of explains why we're in your hotel room
Yeah,
today.
exactly. This is actually quite an event for me. I've never stayed in a room nearly this nice, and I'm somewhat afraid to actually show the people back in Raleigh where they put me up this week.
Yeah, it's actually a pretty posh place that Doug's staying for Tech Ready, which is a field-based event that we're having here in Seattle this week.
And I didn't pick it, so Brian, when you get the expense report, somebody else's fault.
Not Doug's fault.
Yeah.
So you work on what part of Team Foundation?
I work on the source code control piece. I'm the program manager for source control, so I'm the guy who generally gets to go out and talk about it, work with the dev team to actually figure out what it's going to be and make sure that they're building the right stuff.
And where is the dev team based, since you guys are kind of split up?
All the source control dev team is in North Carolina, the same office I'm in.
Okay.
We've got about 20 devs, I think, working on source control.
Yeah, at some point you guys must have to merge all that code with the other folks working on Team Foundation. Where are they based out of?
Sure, actually the rest of them are in Redmond in Building 25 on campus. And we're constantly interacting with them. So we're actually sharing the same source control system, which is Team Foundation Source Control.
Oh, cool.
Located here in Redmond, we've got it set up in North Carolina with a proxy server to optimize the cross-country experience of using source control.
Now, is the proxy server a new piece that's been out of the Team Foundation?
It is indeed. Those people who've used Beta 2, which was the first real public release of Team Foundation that was of enough quality that you would actually install it and play with it, are not familiar with the proxy. It's something we did as a DCR afterwards, and it's really modeled after a proxy that we were already using with our old source control system within Microsoft, which is called Source Depot. Source Depot had a proxy. We thought it worked so well for us being remote that we just felt we had to have one ourselves. And it's been something that we've got a lot of requests from customers for as well. So it's been a great addition.
Now, how does the proxy exactly work?
The proxy will it will take files which are being downloaded to your client machine as you're performing a get operation to pull source from source control, and it actually will set it aside on a file cache on your local LAN, so that instead of you having to fetch those files across a high latency network such as the internet, you actually can pull those off of your high speed local area network. Really dramatically improves the performance. I've got some numbers that show where downloads that were previously taking 14 minutes suddenly are completed in 25 seconds. And behind the scenes, the way it works is actually the client is communicating directly with the Team Foundation server, which in our case is here in Redmond. But when the server instructs the client to download a file, the client goes and asks the local proxy for that file instead. And then the proxy, if it doesn't already have a file cached locally, it'll go ahead and download it to the proxy and then hand it out to the client. So the first user actually has to suffer the same high latency, low bandwidth link, but they're doing it for the team, exactly.
That's okay.
And it actually it's something that you can even set it up so a background job just periodically pulls the latest source down, and then nobody has to suffer that, which is how we use it in North Carolina.
Excellent. Now, why don't we put this one to rest? We get a lot of people, a lot of customers saying, is this a new version of SourceSafe?
Right.
This
is actually not at all a new version of Visual SourceSafe. We've not reused any of the core SourceSafe code. The only place that users will actually see any piece of SourceSafe is in our diff and merge tool, because with V1 we didn't actually have time to build a brand new one. But that is something we're looking at for the next version of the product, and really optimizing that experience. But overall, this is brand new from the ground up. It's a 3-tier ASP.NET application. We've got SQL Server 2005 on the back end. All the data, all the files, everything is going into the SQL Server database, along with the rest of the data that your Team Foundation server is hosting. And that way you can do all of your online SQL Server backups. You've got the same backup and recovery story that you have for any other application you have built on SQL Server. The mid-tier is ASP.NET. It's a web service. It's so between the client and the mid-tier, so it's the exact same architecture that we advocate for our customers to build with. And we think it's quite a testimony for the platform. It's worked really well.
So the administration overhead of this, you're expecting to be pretty basic as long as you have someone familiar with, DB server type of administration?
Yeah, we actually had a goal of keeping the administration to almost nothing. We wanted the user experience of working with the new source control system to be on par with that of Visual SourceSafe. So users who are familiar with SourceSafe would easily be able to pick up the Team Foundation source control experience. There's a little bit more administration required because there is a server. SourceSafe is just leverages a shared file system in order to collaborate among users. So there's a little bit more administration there, but for the most part, it's very basic stuff, same backup and restore that you'd be familiar with, some permission admin, stuff like that. But it's not a very complicated product from that point of view.
And you meant Team Foundation, right? Because I think you said SourceSafe.
Did I say SourceSafe? I'm sorry. Yes, I meant Team Foundation with all of that. Team Foundation is modeled user experience-wise to be very similar to SourceSafe.
Now, so is SourceSafe dead, or what's the story?
No, not at all. Actually, there's a new release of SourceSafe that's coming out with Visual Studio 2005, and they've added some really great new features. For example, they've added their own web service to Visual SourceSafe, so that people who are using Visual SourceSafe across the internet or something like that can leverage the web service. They get a much better experience than they've been having in the past, where the SourceSafe protocol just wasn't optimized for that type of environment. Numbers look pretty promising. It's not quite as fast as Team Foundation, though, and it's certainly not as scalable as Team Foundation.
So who would you recommend using SourceSafe versus Foundation?
Additionally, Team Foundation is much more than just a version control system. There's a bug tracking, defect tracking, we call it work item tracking system. There's a build lab automation system in there. There's a data warehouse that collects data from all across the system, and some great reports that will give you good views into what's happening on your team. And there's a SharePoint WSS server that's included as well. So every time you start a new project, you'll get new source control, new bug tracking, and the new SharePoint portal.
Yep, and process support along with that.
Yeah, the process stuff is also very important, which I sometimes sort of forget to talk about, really, because the way the process has evolved, the process and the tools have evolved somewhat independently, because you didn't want to build a process, it was just modeled at selling our particular tools. So the process is really focused on there's two forms. There's the Agile and the CMMI, and hopefully you guys will have a chance to talk to somebody who's more of an expert than I am on these. But they are evolved very separately, and we've custom tailored the tools to be able to support the process.
Well, it seems to me that a lot of it's about sort of the process enablement piece and not heavy, process overhead to...
Yeah, that's certainly the case. And I think that's really facilitated through the toolage, because the tools can support the process but not really burden you with it, then you don't really realize you're following it.
So Team Foundation sounds like it's not just about version control, it's more about the whole team collaboration piece and not just source control like SourceSafe is.
Yeah, it really is. It's supposed to be end-to-end collaboration for all of your software development, even beyond software development. It's a great tool if you're building any sort of engineering process, you have documents you need to manage, any business process, and you have things you need to manage. Work items, various documents, as I mentioned already. So yeah, it's a great tool across the board, but it's really especially good for software development teams.
Okay, so let's get into a couple techie things.
Okay.
Tell me about path space branching. Did I get that right?
Yes, you got path space branching right. Okay.
And the religious war around this, and what's the alternative?
Well, so there's really two version models, or two branching models that are commonly used in source control systems today. I frequently refer to these as path space branching and version space branching. So with path space branching, when you branch an item, it appears to the user that you are copying that particular item in the version control repository. So if I were to branch a file, I would see another file which would have a different path. So I branched this item in the path space. Whereas with version space branching, in order to actually see the branching structure, you have to look at the version history of the particular file you're looking at. And so if you were to look at that version history, you would see that the version history forks over time for each branch. There's some advantages to both. I actually joined Microsoft as an avid CVS user. They do version space branching. I always thought that was the way to go. I was kind of disappointed with our particular model, but I've really come to respect and and admire. And actually, I over time decided I think the path-based branching is actually offers some really great advantages, which make it a better way to go. For one, we have a very rich file and folder permissioning system built into Team Foundation. And by using path-based branching, because typically when you create a branch, you're creating a new file or folder structure, you can actually apply those ACLs separately to the branch than that of the original file or folder that's in there. So I can create a branch and then I can lock it down so that I'm the only person that can check into it, or I've got at least some control over who is able to commit commit changes to that particular branch, which gives me a lot better access control. The other thing about it is it's really easy to visualize. When you look at version space branching, typically you look at an individual file or folder and you can see its branching structure, but that does not necessarily match the branching structure of a file or folder right next to it. So there's a lack of congruency there, which can make it somewhat difficult to be able to really identify what has been the ancestry of this particular branch over time. With path-based branching, you actually, items get branched together, and therefore the items that are branched together stay together, and it's very easy within the repository browser to actually see which items are together. It really fundamentally comes down to the fact that with path-based branching, you branch up front, whereas typically with version-space branching, you'll branch an item only when it gets modified. So if you can imagine a file that we branched, with path-based branching, I would immediately, as part of that branch operation, be able to see that that particular file has two different entities represented in the repository space. With version space branching, I'd actually have to check it out on the branch and then check it back in before it would show up in the other location. So that delayed, deferred branching model that frequently you get with version space branching can make it somewhat difficult to understand the higher level branching structure that we have. Now, people frequently ask me, all right, well, if you're branching up front, aren't you just wasting space in the repository? And actually, you're not, because when you perform that branch operation, the item that gets created shares the same data on the back end. So it's just referencing the exact same blob in the database, and we don't have to bloat the size of the database in order to create a branch.
Oh, that's great. So we're not using up any extra space, and we're still, providing a level of visibility into what's in that branch. That's probably better than version.
Exactly. Yeah. And version space branching has some advantages as well. I'd say first off, it's less clutter in the repository path space. So sometimes if you branch extensively, you actually have to put a lot of folder hierarchy in place in order to be able to keep your repository nice and neat. But with version space branching, you don't have that. Although it's a lot of cluster in the version history, which has its own complications.
So let's talk about locking, pinning, and labeling.
Okay. Sharing, pinning, and labeling.
Sharing, pinning, labeling, right.
All right. So sharing and pinning are some features of Visual Source Save, which we do not support in Team Foundation. And this has been somewhat controversial, mostly because people who are using Visual Source Save today and have employed sharing and pinning in their practices are having some trouble migrating to Team Foundation because we effectively have eliminated or broken their configuration management strategy. There's a good reason why we don't support sharing, and the reason we don't support sharing sort of gets us to the reason why we don't support pinning. But we have this sort of fundamental philosophy with Team Foundation that you should never be able to check in changes to the repository that you can't be sure are not going to break the build. And therefore, you should always be able to validate the changes you're making on your local workspace before you commit them to the repository where other people are going to consume them, and therefore, potentially, you're breaking them if you break the system when you're checking. The problem with sharing is that as I'm modifying a file in one location on my disk, the way that I propagate that to the shared locations, and that's what sharing is effectively you've got one file which is represented in multiple locations within the repository. The way I propagate that to these other locations is to check it in and then to do a get latest in these other locations. But if I've already checked it in and that change is going to break these other locations, I've already broken the system. And so for that reason, we felt that sharing was fundamentally flawed and that there were better ways of doing code sharing. And specifically, we advocate frequently for users to take this code, which they've shared in multiple locations in the repository, and centralize it, and then reference that from the central location within these other projects. The other option that you have is to branch it into these other locations. And when you branch into those locations, you then have to periodically merge the changes being made between the various locations outward. But you at least have that control over when it's getting changed in that other location, and therefore you can validate that it's not breaking the rest of the code in that other location.
So we're effectively, saving some poor soul from having to buy everyone a beer every time they
Exactly right. Yeah, we do not have that, unfortunately, on our team, where if you break the build, you've got to buy a beer for the rest of the team, or at least for the program managers on the team. But it's actually a good idea. I'll see, maybe I can start something when I get home.
Yeah, new tradition.
Yeah. So, but beyond the sharing thing, pinning. Pinning was really conceived to be used along with sharing. The idea being that when I released a product or something like that, I could share all of the source code into a folder, and I could pin all of those files at that version. And then when it was changing in the original location, pinning would keep it from changing in these other locations. It actually does change, but the pin marks a version of those files which is going to be considered the latest. So if I say, get me that code, the latest version, it would get you what was pinned. Well, when you don't have sharing, you didn't really need pinning so much anymore either. The other thing is I talked to a lot of customers who have built some very error-prone processes around pinning. Every time they check in, they have to actually go manually move a bunch of pins on a bunch of files. And frequently they find somebody forgets to move one of the pins, and they've broken the system by doing that, which is also a problem. So labeling, which you'd also asked about, is somewhat similar to pinning in that it marks specific versions of files. And that is actually how we advocate people who need to use pinning to actually migrate moving forward. And we've got a tool which will migrate a Visual Source Safe database and move all the history and everything into Team Foundation. And that's what it'll do. It's any place you've got a pin file, it'll apply a label to that in Team Foundation so that you can go and request the label and get those particular files.
Cool. So the other question we get a lot is, what's your story on cross-platform support? I do development on other systems. Can I access this via Unix, Linux, Mac boxes?
Sure. Yeah. It's a great question, and it's not something Microsoft's traditionally been very good at answering. But we actually have really recognized that, especially in the enterprise space, Windows is not the only player out there. And we need to be able to support development on all the platforms that the enterprise is using. And so we're working with partners to be able to fill out the product offering in that area. So we've got a few different people who are working on clients which would run in Unix or Linux and Eclipse. One of them is SourceGear. They've got a product called Allerton. SourceGear is a company that many people might be familiar with because they built some add-on products for Visual Source Safe over the years. And they also have their own source control system called Vault, which they sell. But they are building a client which will run on Unix, Linux, the Macintosh, and it will integrate with Eclipse. So that if you're doing Eclipse development on even Windows, you will have that native integration that you might be comfortable with from other systems that you've used. There's also some other initiatives out there, open source initiatives, to build some team system compatibility into Eclipse and other platforms. And so those people are also looking at that. I haven't seen a lot of activity out of those yet, but hoping that we'll see something over the next few months.
And speaking of Team Foundation clients, so we've been telling folks that there isn't going to be an integrated client like VS 2003. Is that still true?
That is actually not true any longer. To explain why we initially made that statement, we were building Visual Studio 2005 to use the 2.0 version of the .NET framework. Visual Studio 2003 uses the 1.1 version of the .NET framework. So we've written a lot of code which depends on 2.0 framework and will not run within the process space of the 1.1 application, which is 2003. So we had, from the start, said it's just not even going to be a goal of ours to solve this particular problem. The other thing that we've done is with Visual Studio 2005, we've built a really rich integration inside of the IDE. And we've leveraged a lot of the interfaces and functionality that's new in Visual Studio 2005. And since that functionality doesn't exist in 2003, it's going to make it pretty difficult for us to port the client back to 2003. But what we've done recently is we've got some people working on a MSDN client. MSDN is the Microsoft Source Code Control Interface, and that's the framework that other source control providers integrate inside of many IDEs, including Visual Studio. But we've got somebody building us a MSDN client that will integrate inside of, from the beginning, it's going to integrate into Visual Basic 6 and Visual C++ 6.0 because it's still going to leverage the 2.0 framework. But we're going to take on the effort to backport our object model to the 1.1 framework so that we'll be able to get this client to integrate into Visual Studio 2003. And we'll make that available as an online download or some sort of power toy about the time that we RTM the product.
Very cool. Anything else along the lines of post-beta 2 stuff that folks can look forward to checking out at some point with one of the CTPs?
Yeah, I think, well, first off, the July CTP was just released last week, which was very exciting. It's actually the same build that we're using for our own internal dog fooding. So it's probably the most stable build we've put out since the beta 2 release. The problem with the July CTP is that it requires a 2-server setup because it uses a version of SQL Server that relies on a different build of the Common Language runtime than the actual build that Team Foundation leverages. So you can't install 2 different versions of the 2.0 framework on the same machine, therefore you have to put them on different machines. So that's a little bit of a pain, makes it a little bit difficult to evaluate it. But if you do get it to evaluate it, you're going to find that the proxy server is part of it, and it'd be an opportunity for you to evaluate the wide area network scenarios that are optimized there. We've done a lot of performance work throughout the product. We got hit pretty hard with Beta 2 because we hadn't done any performance optimizations inside the IDE, and in some cases we were just doing some stupid things. So we've gone in and we think we've fixed all those. We've shared that out with some of our early adopter customers and been getting pretty good feedback on it. So we think that the performance of source control within the IDE is probably about on par with what you get from the command line today.
I've heard that. It's cool.
And so that's actually a significant improvement, many thousands of times faster in certain scenarios. So that's probably the other really big thing. We've certainly fixed a lot of bugs. We've cleaned up some UI. I hope that people will find that it's a little bit easier to use. The Beta 2 wasn't the most user-friendly product in the world. And we've tried to address some of those things. We're continuing to do that.
Awesome. Well, hey, Doug, thanks.
Hey, no problem.
We'll your demo.
Okay, that's great. We're going to do the demo back out in North Carolina and see if perhaps we can get some people from the product team out there involved.
Awesome.
All right?
Thank you.
Thank you, Beth.